Whole towns vanished into the sea. Kings died in the woods, under circumstances nobody ever pinned down. This is a list of medieval mysteries, most of them barely known, moving in the order they happened, starting in the year 536. In the year 536, the sky over Constantinople went dim. The historian Procopius, who was there, wrote that the sun gave off its light without any real brightness, looking the way it does during an eclipse. 2 years later, another writer named Cassiodorus said the moon gave off no real light even when full, and described a winter without storms, a spring without mildness, and a summer without heat. This wasn't confined to one place. Chinese records from the same years describe a famine so severe in one region that 70 to 80% of the local population died, some from cannibalism. Irish tree rings from 536 and 542 show almost no growth at all. A Welsh chronicle records widespread death across Britain and Ireland in 537, in the same entry that mentions the death of King Arthur at the Battle of Camlan. Summers across Europe dropped by as much as 2.5 degrees Celsius below normal that year. A second event around 539 or 540 dropped temperatures again by close to 3 degrees, and there's evidence of a third eruption in 547. The historian Michael McCormick has called 536 the start of one of the worst periods in history to be alive, maybe the worst year of all. Crop failures followed across Europe, the Middle East, and China. So did the plague of Justinian, which killed millions of people between 541 and 549. Something caused all of this. Ice cores show a spike in sulfate deposits around the year 534, and tree rings back up, a sudden, sharp cooling. That much is settled. What caused it is not. For decades, historians assumed a volcano, and one candidate after another has been proposed and ruled out. A volcano called Rabaul in Papua New Guinea was an early guess, until later dating placed that eruption more than a century afterward. Krakatoa was proposed next, based on a Javanese record that was redated to 535, but drilling in the strait there found no eruption at that time at all. A Central American volcano called Ilopango was suggested too, until ice core evidence dated that eruption to roughly 100 years earlier. Icelandic volcanoes were floated based on shards found in a Swiss glacier, but the chemistry of that ash doesn't match what's sealed in the ice cores from 536. The best current guess points to North America instead. Geochemical analysis has found at least 3 eruptions around the same time, one likely from monocraters in California and 2 more probably from Alaska. Even that is described as likely, not confirmed. A separate, competing idea has nothing to do with volcanoes at all. A researcher named Dallas Abbott found nickel and copper spherules in an ice core from the period, the kind of debris usually tied to a meteorite or comet strike, rather than an eruption. Some writers have tried to connect this one event to nearly everything that came after it. The plague, the fall of empires in Persia and India, the rise of Islam, even the collapse of the city of Teotihuacan in Mexico. That version of the story, popularized by the writer David Keyes, isn't accepted by mainstream historians. One archaeologist, Ken Dark, called the evidence behind it highly debatable, based on poor sources or simply wrong. What's left, in the end, is this. Something blotted out the sun for the better part of 2 years, killed crops across 3 continents, and helped set off one of history's worst plagues. Nobody has ever found the volcano responsible, or even confirmed that the volcano was to blame at all. About 90 years after that darkened sky, on the coast of eastern England, someone buried a king. In 1939, near the River Deben in Suffolk, at a site called Sutton Hoo, a landowner named Edith Pretty hired a local, self-taught archaeologist named Basil Brown to dig into a group of low mounds on her land. Brown had already found scattered Anglo-Saxon graves in the smaller mounds. Then, in May of that year, he opened Mound 1, and rivets started turning up in the sand, the outline of a ship 27 meters long, dragged up from the river and buried whole 1300 years before. At the center of the ship was a burial chamber packed with gold and garnet jewelry, a ceremonial helmet, a sword, a shield, silver plates imported from the Eastern Roman Empire, a lyre, and 37 gold coins from Francia, each one from a different mint. The find was rich enough that a treasure inquest ruled it belonged to Pretty, who then gave the whole thing to the British Museum. The grave itself holds one detail that makes the whole burial hard to explain. There was no body inside it, only a stain in the soil, a chemical trace where a body should have been. For years, some archaeologists wondered whether the ship had been buried empty, as a monument rather than a grave. Later testing of the phosphates in the soil supports the idea that the body really was there once and simply dissolved in the acidic ground over the centuries. Either way, nobody knows who it was. The leading guess has been Radwald, a king of the East Angles who died around 624, first proposed by a historian named Chadwick back in 1940. He remains, according to archaeologist Martin Carver, the favorite candidate, mostly because the wealth and the dates line up, and because the site sits close to the old East Anglian royal settlement at Rendlesham. Other historians have called the case weak. The Oxford Dictionary of National Biography says the case is argued with more confidence than actual proof, and two other scholars have called the supporting evidence almost non-existent. Radwald's sons have been proposed too. So has the idea that the man buried there wasn't a king at all, just someone rich and important. In 2025, a historian at Oxford named Helen Gittos argued the body belonged to a local soldier who had fought for the Byzantine Empire. Small details in the burial only add more questions. Two silver spoons are inscribed in Greek with the names Paul and Saul. Maybe a baptismal gift, maybe not. Where patterns on the sword suggest the person buried was left-handed. In 2016, chemical testing found bitumen in the grave that matches material from modern-day Syria, and nobody knows what it was doing there. A bronze bucket found at the site carries a Greek inscription wishing its owner, addressed as Master Count, good health and many happy years, a strange thing to turn up buried in eastern England in the 7th century. Sutton Hoo has been dug up again several times since 1939, in the 60s, the 80s, and as recently as 2024. Each dig adds detail without answering the basic question. Somebody important was buried there with a fortune in gold and 37 oarsmen's worth of coins in a ship meant to carry the dead into whatever came next. His name didn't survive the trip. Not far from Sutton Hoo, and from around the same century, another Anglo-Saxon find turned up completely by accident. On the 5th of July 2009, a man named Terry Herbert was metal detecting in a field near the village of Hammerwich in Staffordshire when he started finding gold. He kept digging for 5 days before he called in a local archaeologist, the start of what's now called the Staffordshire Hoard. Over the following weeks, professional excavators recovered more than 3,500 pieces of gold, silver, and garnet, the largest hoard of Anglo-Saxon gold ever found, more than 5 kilograms of it. A public fundraising campaign later paid £3.285 million to keep it in Britain, split between Herbert and the farmer who owned the land. The two of them reportedly fell out afterward over how to divide the money. The hoard was buried sometime between 650 and 675 in the kingdom of Mercia. What makes it strange is what's in it and what isn't. Almost everything is military. Sword fittings, helmet fragments, gold stripped off the hilts of swords. There are 66 gold sword collars and 86 pommels, the largest collection of pommels ever found in one place. There's no jewelry for women, no household objects, no burial goods of the kind that usually comes with a body. There was no body at all. Nobody knows why someone gathered all this war gear, stripped the gold off it, and buried it in a field. One theory connects it to Heriot, a custom where a nobleman's war equipment was handed over to the king when he died. Another ties it to a king named Pida, who briefly ruled Mercia in 655. A third connects the burial instead to a Viking raid on nearby Lichfield in 875, though that date sits awkwardly next to the 650 to 675 estimate for when the hoard itself went into the ground. One object in the hoard raises its own separate question. A gold cross was found folded up, bent nearly in half to fit wherever it was buried. Nobody can say for sure why. It might have been folded just to make it fit. It might have been folded by pagans who didn't care what it meant. Or it might have been folded by Christians on purpose to strip it of its holiness before it went into the ground with the rest of the loot. All three explanations are still on the table. A gold strip found with the hoard is inscribed with a line from the Book of Numbers in Latin, calling on God to scatter his enemies. The historian Kat Jarman has called the whole find possibly the finest collection of early medieval artifacts ever discovered. What it was actually for, and who put it in the ground, is still a guess. Byzantium, further east, had its own secret buried around the same stretch of decades. Not gold in the ground this time, but a weapon nobody else could copy. Around the year 672, the Byzantine Empire started using a weapon later known as Greek fire, one that could set the sea itself on fire. According to the chronicler Theophanes, it was invented by a man named Kallinikos, an architect who had fled to Constantinople from Heliopolis in Syria after Arab armies took the city. His sea fire, pumped through bronze tubes mounted on ship prows, burned enemy ships during the first and second Arab sieges of Constantinople, and kept turning up in Byzantine victories for the next 400 years against the Rus in 941 and 1043, against the Bulgarians in the 970s, in civil wars, and against crusaders as late as the 1200s. Enemies captured the equipment more than once. The Bulgars took 36 siphons and a stock of the substance itself in the early 800s. Arabs captured a fire ship in 827. Neither side ever worked out how to reproduce it. The recipe stayed a Byzantine state secret for centuries, and it has never been fully recovered. The stories about how well it was guarded got dramatic fast. One Byzantine emperor told his son the formula had been given to the first Christian emperor, Constantine, by an angel, and that the corrupt official who once leaked part of the secret was struck down by a flame from heaven before he could reach a church. That's legend, not history. It shows how seriously the empire treated the secret. What was actually in it is still argued over. 19th century French chemists thought it might be an early form of gunpowder based on saltpeter, but saltpeter isn't recorded in Middle Eastern or European warfare until centuries later, so that idea has mostly been dropped. A theory involving quicklime reacting with water was tested in 1932 and found too weak to match the descriptions. Another theory involving calcium phosphide made by boiling bones in urine also failed to reproduce the described effect under experiment. Most modern historians now favor a base of petroleum or naphtha, thickened with resin, so it would burn on contact with water. Byzantium had access to crude oil from the Black Sea region, and the 9th century Latin text names naphtha directly as the main ingredient. Even that account admits quicklime or saltpeter can be fully ruled out as minor additives. In 2002, a historian named John Haldon built a working reconstruction and got the flame over 1,000 degrees Celsius with a range of about 15 meters. It's a good guess at how the weapon might have worked. It isn't the formula. As late as the 1800s, an Ottoman-era Armenian chemist named Kavafian claimed to have reinvented Greek fire, refused to hand over the formula, and was reportedly poisoned by the Ottoman government before he ever gave it up. The naval historian John Julius Norwich once wrote that it's hard to overstate how important Greek fire was to Byzantine history. 13 centuries later, nobody can say exactly what it was. 130 years or so after Greek fire first burned Arab ships, in Sweden, a grieving father carved something into stone that people are still arguing about. Sometime in the early 800s, in the village of Rök in Sweden, a man named Varin carved a stone, what's now called the Rök runestone, in memory of his dead son, Vemod. The stone stands about 8 feet tall and weighs around 5 tons, and the message on it runs to roughly 760 characters across 5 sides, the longest runic inscription ever found on stone. Varin didn't just write a simple memorial. He referenced Theodoric the Great, an Ostrogothic king who had died nearly 300 years earlier. He invoked the god Thor. He included what looks like a fragment of Norse mythology, about 20 kings, that doesn't survive anywhere else, 4 groups of 5 brothers, all sharing names within each group. Partway through, he switched from the common runic alphabet of his own time to an older one, then started encrypting sections using a letter shift cipher and special code runes of his own. Scholars have worked out how to read the runes themselves. What the text actually means is still argued over. One historian, Elias Vesen, thought Varin simply wrote it to honor his son, using myth as tribute. Another, Otto von Friesen, thought it was meant to stir up his people for revenge, tied to some battle that had cost the son his life. A separate theory holds that Varin was a kind of tribal storyteller, preserving myths that would otherwise die with him. Another says the whole thing was meant to boost a chieftain's authority by listing his line of powerful ancestors. More recently, researchers at 3 Swedish universities proposed the inscription might be a folk memory of a much older catastrophe, the extreme cold and crop failure of the 530s, the same event covered earlier in this list, along with a later solar storm around 774 and 775, and a near total eclipse in 810. Under this theory, Varin was writing about old fears of another world-ending winter, not really about his son at all. One theory, published in 2015, goes further still, suggesting the whole inscription isn't about kings or myths at all, and is really just a set of riddles about the business of carving the stone itself. Most of the named figures in the text, aside from Theodoric, a Valkyrie named Gunnar, and Thor, are simply unknown. One word near the end of the inscription, read as Nit, has never been translated at all. Scholars studying it just call it uninterpreted. Whatever Varin was trying to say to his dead son, or to whoever read the stone after him, most of it stayed inside his own head. Around the same centuries, something else was being made in Northern Europe that people still can't fully explain. Not words carved into stone, but blades. About 170 medieval swords, dated from the 800s to the 1000s, carry the same inscription inlaid into the blade, plus VLFBERH plus T, or a close variant of it. Ulfbert was a Frankish name, and the swords are generally assumed to have been made somewhere in the Frankish Rhineland. Almost none of them have actually turned up there. Most were found scattered across Scandinavia and the Baltic, with 3 even further away in Volga, Bulgaria, deep into what's now Russia. Frankish law at the time banned selling weapons like this to outsiders, so historians think the swords reaching the north weren't sold at all, more likely looted, taken as ransom, or smuggled. The northern concentration might just come down to burial customs. Pagans in Scandinavia buried their dead with grave goods, including weapons, while Christian Francia generally didn't. So more northern swords simply survived long enough to be dug up centuries later. The blades themselves aren't consistent either. One found in a grave in Moravia has a pattern welded core with separately hardened edges welded on. Another is made from a much higher grade of steel, likely imported from somewhere in Central Asia. Same name stamped into the metal. 2 very different levels of craftsmanship, which raises the obvious question of how many blades are genuine Ulfbert work and how many just borrowed a famous name. 2 modern researchers who've counted the Finnish examples alone don't even agree with each other. One counts 14, the other counts 31. Nobody has fully worked out where these swords were forged, why the steel quality varies so much under the same name, or why a weapon banned for export ended up scattered across an entire continent's worth of graves. Not every Viking era find in that part of the world involves treasure. Some of it is a lot grimmer. In 2009, archaeologists digging a route for a new road near Weymouth in Dorset, England, found a mass grave in an old Roman quarry at a site called Ridgeway Hill. It held 54 skeletons, all men, all dismembered, and 51 skulls, piled up separately to one side. At first, the dig's leaders assumed it was Roman, dating back to the conquest of Britain. Radiocarbon testing said otherwise. The men had died sometime between the years 970 and 1025. Isotope analysis of the teeth from 10 of the skeletons showed the men had grown up in Scandinavia, one of them based on the isotope signature from north of the Arctic Circle. Most were in their late teens to mid-20s, with a handful older. None had clothing or belongings buried with them. Between them, the bodies carried 188 wounds, all from a large, very sharp weapon, and many of the cuts show signs of being made while the men were still alive. Who ordered this and why isn't known. The working assumption is that these were Vikings caught raiding or trying to raid Anglo-Saxon territory and executed by the locals. One documentary raised a possible link to the St. Brice's Day massacre, an order given by King Ethelred the Unready in 1002 to kill Danish settlers across England. But the connection is only ever described as a possibility, not a confirmed one. Another theory ties it to a broader kingdom-wide campaign against Vikings, again without direct proof. A few details stand out. One man's hands had been sliced through, apparently while he was grabbing at the blade swinging toward him. Another had the top of his skull cut clean off. There were 3 more bodies than skulls, which has led to speculation that a few heads, maybe belonging to higher status men, were kept elsewhere, possibly displayed somewhere as a warning. The wounds themselves were messy enough that researchers concluded whoever did the killing wasn't trained for it. This wasn't a formal execution by professionals. It was a lot of people with swords and 54 men who didn't get to leave. England has one more mystery from around this stretch of centuries, and this one is carved into a hillside instead of buried in the ground. On a hillside above the village of Cerne Abbas in Dorset, there's a chalk figure of a giant man 55 meters tall, carrying a club 37 meters long, with an unmistakable feature that Britain's tourist board has spent decades being coy about. Nobody wrote about it existing until 1694, when a churchwarden's account recorded a payment of 3 shillings for repairing the giant. Earlier, land surveys of the same area from the 1540s and 1617 don't mention it at all. That silence used to make historians fairly confident the giant was carved sometime in the 1600s, maybe as a joke about Oliver Cromwell, whom his enemies sometimes mockingly called England's Hercules, with the club standing in for his military rule. Local tradition offers a different version of the same theory, that it was the local landowner's own tenants who carved it, mocking him instead. Then, in 2020, the National Trust ran a dating test on soil samples from deep in the monument itself, using a technique called optically stimulated luminescence, which measures when buried sand grains last saw sunlight. The results pointed to a construction date somewhere between the years 700 and 1100, the Anglo-Saxon period, not the 1600s at all, except some samples from the same site dated as late as 1560, which muddies the picture rather than settling it. One explanation on offer is that the figure was cut once, abandoned, and recut later, which would explain 2 very different dates coming out of the same hillside. Earlier, surveys using ground-penetrating equipment in the 1980s and 90s found evidence the giant used to carry something over his left arm, possibly a cloak or an animal skin, and something under his left hand that might have been a severed head, both long since worn away or filled in. A 2020 laser survey also concluded that the figure's most talked about feature was added later than the rest of the outline, which was probably clothed originally. Who the giant is supposed to represent is its own separate argument. One archaeologist in the 1930s connected it to Hercules, tied to a Roman-era religious revival under the Emperor Commodus. Another comparison points to a Celtic god called Nodens, based on a carving found nearby. A more recent study, from 2024, proposes the figure was cut around the year 900 as a mustering point for West Saxon armies, meant to depict Hercules, and was only later reinterpreted by monks at the newly founded Cerne Abbey as a local saint. So the giant might be 1100 years old or 300, might depict a Roman god, a Saxon rallying symbol, a Puritan lord, or the Lord's own tenants laughing at him. Every one of those explanations still has a hole in it. Move forward to the 11th century, to Normandy, and to the most famous embroidery in European history. Despite the name, the Bayeux tapestry is embroidery, not woven cloth, wool yarn stitched onto linen, nearly 70 meters long and about half a meter tall. Across 58 scenes with Latin captions, it tells the story of the Norman conquest of England, ending with the Battle of Hastings in October 1066. Most historians think it was commissioned by Bishop Odo of Bayeux, William the Conqueror's half-brother, made by English needleworkers sometime in the 1070s, possibly finished in time for the dedication of Bayeux Cathedral in 1077. Its survival alone is close to a miracle. It's first recorded in a cathedral inventory from 1476. It survived a sack of Bayeux in 1562. During the French Revolution, in 1792, it was nearly cut up to cover military wagons before a local lawyer stepped in and saved it. The Nazis wanted it during the Second World War. Himmler ordered it moved somewhere safe in August 1944, a message British code breakers at Bletchley Park intercepted, but Paris was retaken before German forces could act on it. It came back to Bayeux in 1945, and in 2026, it travels to the British Museum for the first time in around 900 years. Who exactly commissioned it is still argued over, even with Odo as the leading candidate. French legend credits William's wife, Queen Matilda, and her ladies, which is where its French nickname comes from, but that's treated as legend, not history. One historian has proposed Edith of Wessex, Edward the Confessor's widow, as the patron instead. Another argues it was actually made in France, at an abbey in the Loire Valley. Even the individual designer is disputed between two different named candidates, an abbot from Canterbury and the Archbishop of Canterbury himself. The most famous scene in the whole embroidery might not show what people think it shows. The death of King Harold, struck down at Hastings, is usually remembered as an arrow through the eye. But engravings made in the 1730s, before some restoration work was done, show a spear or lance in that scene instead, with no arrow fletching at all, and needle holes in the fabric suggest the image has been altered at some point. Whether Harold actually died from an arrow to the eye is still heavily debated by the record's own account. One panel has never been explained at all. It shows a cleric touching or striking the face of a woman named Elfgiva, with no other context given anywhere in the scene. Nobody knows who she was or what the moment meant. The embroidery itself is incomplete too. Its final panel or panels are missing, so nobody knows exactly how the story originally ended, beyond what can be guessed from what survives. Even the reactions to it vary. Charles Dickens, centuries later, called it plainly the work of amateurs, and feeble amateurs at that. A modern conservator has called its survival close to a miracle. A few decades after the conquest, one of William's own sons died in a way that's never been fully settled either. On the 2nd of August, 1100, King William II of England, known as William Rufus, the third son of William the Conqueror, went hunting in the New Forest with a small party that included his younger brother, Henry, and a nobleman named Walter Tyrrell. He was killed by an arrow through the chest. His hunting party left his body where it fell in the forest and rode off. It was later found by a peasant charcoal burner and carried to Winchester Cathedral. Walter Tyrrell was blamed later for losing the fatal arrow while aiming at a stag. He fled to France immediately and swore under oath years afterward that he hadn't even seen the king that day. Henry, meanwhile, didn't linger at the scene at all. He rode straight to Winchester, took control of the royal treasury, then went on to London and had himself crowned 3 days later, before either archbishop of the realm could even arrive to object. His older brother Robert, who had a stronger claim to the throne and was away on crusade, got back to Normandy only a month after William was already dead and Henry was already king. Was it an accident or was it arranged? Historians are still split. Frank Barlow points out that hunting accidents were common enough at the time, and there is no hard evidence of a plot. Austin Lane Poole took the opposite view, writing that the facts look ugly and seem to point to a plot. John Gillingham argues that if Henry had actually planned a murder, he picked a strange moment to do it, since war between his two older brothers looked likely anyway, and might have removed one of his rivals without Henry lifting a finger. C. Warren Hollister, who wrote Henry's biography, notes that nobody at the time seems to have had any such suspicions, though he also allows that Henry might still have used Tyrrell deliberately, since Henry later showed particular favor to Tyrrell's in-laws, the family of Clare. The details around the death haven't held up well either. The spot marked today by the so-called Rufus Stone only became attached to a specific location because Charles II visited it centuries later, in the 1600s. The earliest source giving a precise place name for the killing was written by John Leland in 1530, 430 years after the fact. Even William's tomb at Winchester Cathedral, long assumed to be his, is now thought by some historians to belong to his nephew instead. His skull is missing. Local legend has filled in the gaps the historical record left open. Tyrrell is supposed to have washed the king's blood off his hands in a nearby pond, which locals say turns red every year since. A phantom black dog, called Tyrrell's Hound, is said to still appear in the forest as a death omen. None of that is history. What's actually known is that a king died from an arrow in a forest. The one witness denied being there, and the man who benefited most was crowned within the week. While Norman kings were dying under disputed circumstances in an English forest, smiths a continent away were making something European steel couldn't match. For roughly 1400 years, from around the 3rd century through to the 1700s, weaponsmiths across the Near East produced blades known as Damascus steel, famous for a rippling banded pattern in the metal and a reputation for cutting an iron bar without dulling or slicing through a piece of silk floating down onto the edge. The raw steel, called woods, wasn't actually made in Damascus at all. It came from small clay furnaces in southern India and Sri Lanka, shipped west to weapons centers across the Near East, including Damascus itself, where smiths forged it into blades but never produced the raw steel locally. By around 1900, the tradition had died out. The last documented account of the process comes from Sri Lanka in 1903. Why it disappeared is still guesswork. One theory blames disrupted trade routes that once carried the ore. Another points to trace elements like tungsten or vanadium present in the original ore veins and missing once sourcing patterns shifted. A third blames the loss of a specific thermal cycling technique used in forging. A fourth points to British colonial era mining restrictions in India, cutting off both the raw ore and the local knowledge needed to work it. None of the four has ever been confirmed as the actual cause. In 2006, a German research team led by Peter Povler used electron microscopy on an old Damascus blade and reported finding carbon nanotubes and cementite nanowires inside the metal, a genuinely strange claim, since carbon nanotubes weren't supposed to exist in anything made before the 20th century. An American researcher, John Verhoeven, disputed the finding, arguing the structures were more likely ordinary cementite rods, misread as something more exotic. The dispute over what's actually in these old blades has never been fully resolved. One popular story about Damascus steel is definitely false, that the metal was hardened by plunging the hot blade into a living person. That story traces directly back to a hoax newspaper article printed in the Chicago Tribune on the 4th of November, 1894, crediting a made-up professor and a scroll supposedly found among the ruins of ancient Tyre. None of it was real, but the story still circulates as though it were genuine medieval practice. Modern bladesmiths have gotten close to matching the old steel using thermal cycling techniques worked out by researchers in the 1990s, and laser manufactured recreations have actually exceeded the mechanical properties of the originals. What nobody has fully recovered is the exact original process, the reason it vanished, or a final answer on whether those Dresden nanotubes are real. England produced a much stranger story around the same century, one with no weapons and no politics in it at all. Just two children nobody could explain. Sometime in the 12th century, probably during the reign of King Stephen, villagers in Woolpit, Suffolk, found two children near one of the village's wolf pits at harvest time. Both had green-tinted skin. Both spoke a language nobody recognized. They wore unfamiliar clothes, and at first would eat nothing but raw broad beans. Two chroniclers wrote about it not long after: William of Newburgh, around 1189, and Ralph of Coggeshall, around 1220. Their accounts don't fully agree with each other. The children were taken in at the manor of a local landowner, Richard de Calne. Over time, they adjusted to normal food, and their skin color faded to normal. The boy, described as sickly, died soon after the pair were baptized. The girl survived, learned English, and reportedly said the two of them came from a land where the sun never rose, only a kind of permanent twilight, and that they had been tending cattle when a noise, like bells, she said, carried them suddenly to the wolf pit where they were found. She stayed in service at the manor for years afterward, remembered by one chronicler as unusually wild and disrespectful, and, per the other, eventually married a man from King's Lynn. Nobody has ever pinned down what actually happened. William himself, writing it down, added a line in Latin that translates roughly to saying he felt forced enough that he had to believe it himself, a chronicler hedging his own story even as he told it. Explanations have piled up for centuries without any of them fully working. 17th century writers guessed the children fell from heaven or from the moon. A folklorist named Charles Oman thought some kind of mystery lay behind it, maybe drugging and kidnapping. One modern reading treats the whole account as an allegory for Norman conquest over the Welsh, Irish, and Scots, not a literal event at all. The most commonly cited theory today holds that the children were Flemish orphans, displaced by a real 1173 battle nearby, where Flemish mercenaries were massacred, with their green skin explained by a nutritional deficiency called chlorosis, sometimes known as green sickness. A historian named Brian Houghton calls this the most widely accepted explanation at present, and then immediately adds that it doesn't hold up in many respects. Another historian points out that an educated landowner like Richard de Calne should have recognized spoken Flemish, if that's really what the children were speaking. A modern folk singer collecting local legend in the 1970s found villagers who claimed descent from the Green Children, but wouldn't say who they actually were. A modern historian, Nancy Partner, has said flatly that searching for a real explanation at all is a waste of effort. Nobody has one that survives its own scrutiny. Around the same decades, a rumor started spreading across Europe about a Christian king ruling somewhere far to the east, and Europeans spent the next 400 years looking for him. In 1145, a German chronicler named Otto of Freising recorded a report from the Bishop of Jabala. Somewhere in the east, a Christian priest king named Prester John had defeated Muslim armies and ruled over an enormous, wealthy kingdom. The story helped stir up support for the Second Crusade. 20 years later, a forged letter began circulating across Europe, addressed to the Byzantine emperor and describing Prester John's realm in extravagant detail: gems, gold, a kingdom stretching from Persia to China. In 1177, Pope Alexander III sent his own physician to find this king. The physician was never heard from again. As the Mongol Empire rose in the 1200s, Europeans decided Prester John must be a Mongol-era ruler, especially Toghrul, the real Nestorian Christian king of the Karaite people who had actually raised the young Genghis Khan before the two went to war. When the Mongol Empire declined, the legend shifted location again, this time to Ethiopia. In 1487, a Portuguese envoy named Pero da Covilhã was sent partly to find Prester John there. By 1520, when another Portuguese envoy made direct contact with the actual Ethiopian emperor, Europeans simply started calling him Prester John too, even though, as the record shows, the Ethiopians had never called their own emperor that. Ethiopian ambassadors said as much themselves, more than once. In 1441, at a church council in Florence, Ethiopian representatives pointed out that the name didn't appear anywhere in their own emperor's official list of titles. In 1751, a Czech missionary asked an Ethiopian emperor directly about the name, and the emperor was reportedly taken aback, saying Abyssinian kings had never called themselves that. So where did the legend actually start? Nobody knows for certain. One historian connects the original 1145 report to a real battle near Samarkand in 1141, where a Buddhist army defeated Seljuk Turks, though, since the winning side wasn't Christian at all, that connection is shaky at best. Another historian suggests the legend grew out of the Karaite people of Central Asia, many of whom really had converted to Christianity around the year 1000. A separate, much later theory holds that the whole thing was invented as propaganda by the weakening Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem to talk Europe into funding more distant wars. For over 400 years, Europeans searched for a specific Christian king who, as far as the record shows, never existed at all, reassigning the same title to whichever distant, half-understood ruler fit the story best at the time. Not every 12th century mystery involves a search across continents. Some of them are a few small figures carved from walrus tusk. Sometime between 1150 and 1200, someone carved 93 small chess pieces, kings, queens, bishops, knights, and pawns, out of walrus ivory and whale tooth, later known as the Lewis chessmen, most likely made in Trondheim, Norway, though some researchers argue instead for Iceland or even local manufacture in Scotland's Outer Hebrides. In 1831, they were found on the Isle of Lewis. The man usually credited with the discovery wasn't even named in print until 1863, more than 30 years after the fact, a local farmer named Malcolm MacLeod. The pieces were split up almost immediately. Most were bought by the British Museum for 80 guineas. A smaller group ended up, decades later, with the National Museum of Scotland. At least one piece stayed in private hands for so long that nobody realized it was part of the set. A missing warder piece resurfaced in Edinburgh in 2019 and sold at auction for £735,000, having gone unrecognized for at least 55 years. Even the basic facts about the hoard are unsettled. The traditional story places the find at Uig Bay, but researchers at the National Museum of Scotland argue a different beach, 6 miles south, is more likely. The pieces themselves don't form one complete matching set. There are enough duplicate pieces to suggest at least 5 separate sets mixed together, probably from different workshops, possibly gathered up by a merchant carrying them as stock. A few pieces don't match any of the identified groups at all, and might be later replacements for ones that broke or went missing before they were ever buried or lost. 4 of the rook pieces are carved as wild-eyed warriors biting the edges of their own shields, a detail nobody has fully explained either, though it's usually read as a depiction of berserkers. Traces of red pigment found on some pieces suggest the set might originally have used red and white sides instead of the black and white most people assume. Where exactly they were made, where exactly they were found, and how many original sets went into the hoard are all still open questions, more than 190 years after a Hebridean farmer dug the first ones up. By the early 1200s, the crusading movement that helped popularize the Prester John story had curdled into something much sadder, an episode remembered, not entirely accurately, as a children's crusade. In the spring of 1212, a shepherd boy from the Rhineland named Nicholas gathered a crowd and tried to lead them across the Alps into Italy, telling them the sea would part for them once they reached it. Roughly 2 out of every 3 people on that crossing died. About 7,000 reached Genoa by late August. The sea didn't part. Most of the group accepted an offer of citizenship from the city and settled there instead. Nicholas pushed on to Pisa, where 2 ships bound for Jerusalem took on some of his remaining followers, who may, the record only says maybe, have actually reached the Holy Land. Nicholas went on to meet Pope Innocent III, who told everyone left to go home. Nicholas didn't survive the trip back. His father, blamed for the whole disaster, was later arrested and hanged by the families of the dead. A separate movement started the same June, led by a 12-year-old French shepherd named Stephen of Cloyes, who claimed a disguised Jesus had given him a letter for the King of France. He gathered more than 30,000 followers, mostly children, and marched them toward Marseille. King Philip II told them to disperse. By the time Stephen reached Marseille at the end of June, 2 merchants, Hugh the Iron and William of Posqueres, offered to ferry the remaining group across the Mediterranean for a fee. What happened next depends on which account survives. Some were reportedly sold into slavery in Tunisia. Others died in a shipwreck off Sardinia. That's the traditional version, and historians now think a lot of it is conflated from a mix of real events and later myth-making. The real historiographical fight is over something more basic. Were these child crusaders actual children at all? A Dutch historian named Pieter Reyets argued in 1977 that the medieval Latin words used to describe the crowds, parvuli, pueri, infantes, weren't literal age descriptions, but a social label for the wandering poor, adults without property included. A later historian, Gary Dixon, pushed back, arguing that actual children really were present and played a real role in the movement. Even the original chroniclers weren't consistent. One scholar identified around 50 period sources mentioning the event, ranging from a few sentences to half a page, and considered only about 20 of them reliable enough to build on. The crusade never got papal approval to count as an actual crusade at all. What's clear is that a large crowd of poor, mostly young people, set out for the Holy Land in 1212, believing in a miracle that never happened, and that most of them never got anywhere close to it. The year Genghis Khan died, 15 years later, his own followers went to the opposite extreme, hiding his death so well that nobody has ever found where he's buried. Genghis Khan died in August 1227. According to legend, he asked his sons before he died to keep his burial site secret, and his body was carried back into Mongolia and buried without any markers at all. The surrounding region, close to the sacred mountain Burkhan Khaldun, became known as the Ich Horig, or the Great Taboo, a restricted zone of roughly 240 square kilometers where only Mongol royalty were allowed to enter, on penalty of death. That restriction held, in one form or another, well into the 20th century. Nobody has ever found the tomb. Expeditions have tried repeatedly. A Japanese team investigated a candidate site in the 1990s, but was shut down by local objections. In 2001, an American-Mongolian team found a walled burial ground near a site called Batshirit, with at least 20 unopened tombs, none confirmed as the Khan's. In 2004, researchers found what they believe was one of Genghis Khan's palaces, about 150 miles east of the modern capital. In 2015, a crowdsourced satellite imaging project run by a researcher named Albert Yumin Lin flagged 55 potential burial sites, none of them confirmed either. That same year, a French team using drone imaging identified what looks like a 250-meter man-made mound on top of Burkhan Khaldun itself, which is still an active pilgrimage site for local Mongolians today. That finding was never formally published, because the expedition didn't have government authorization to be there in the first place. The famous story about how the tomb was hidden, that 2,000 slaves built it, were then killed by soldiers who were then killed themselves, who then committed mass suicide to protect the secret, is usually credited to Marco Polo. It doesn't actually appear in any source from the period. It also runs against a separate, well-documented fact. A tribe called the Darhad openly and traditionally guarded the area for generations, which doesn't fit with everyone who knew the location supposedly being dead. Other legends about how the site was concealed include a river deliberately diverted over the grave, horses stampeded across it to erase tracks, and trees planted to hide it entirely. A different legend claims the burial was found again 30 years later, when a baby camel that had been buried alongside the Khan grew up, and its mother, brought back to the area, wept at the exact spot where her calf had died. Even the old Chinese and Mongol sources disagree on basic details. One 17th century source suggests the coffin that arrived back in Mongolia may have been empty. An earlier source says only the Khan's shirt, tent, and boots were buried at a separate memorial site. Nearly 800 years and multiple modern expeditions later, nobody has found the actual grave. Around the same years, in Bohemia, monks were finishing a book so large that legend says the devil helped write it. In the early 1200s, at a Benedictine monastery in Podlažice, in what's now the Czech Republic, someone finished copying a manuscript now called the Codex Gigas, which measures 92 centimeters long, weighs nearly 75 kilograms, and contains the entire Bible alongside historical and medical texts. 310 surviving vellum pages, made from the skins of around 160 animals. It's the largest medieval manuscript known to survive. Legend says a monk, sentenced to be walled up alive for breaking his vows, promised to write the whole thing in a single night to earn his freedom, a book containing all human knowledge to glorify the monastery. Near midnight, unable to finish, he prayed to the devil for help, offering his soul in exchange. The devil finished it for him, and the monk added a full-page portrait of the devil to the book as thanks. The actual handwriting is remarkably uniform, and scholars have identified it as the work of a single scribe, sometimes credited by name as Hermann Inclusus, Hermann the Recluse. That uniformity is probably what gave rise to the legend in the first place. The writing shows no sign of age, illness, or decline across the entire book, a level of consistency real single scribe manuscripts of this size rarely have. Researchers now estimate the actual writing process took something like 20 to 30 years, not one night. The book was pawned to another monastery, seized and passed between owners for centuries, and eventually taken by the Swedish army as war loot at the end of the 30 Years' War in 1648. It's been in Stockholm ever since. In 1697, a fire broke out at the Swedish royal castle where it was kept, and the book was saved by being thrown out a window where, according to one account, it landed on and injured a bystander below. 12 pages are missing from the manuscript, cut out at some point in its history. Nobody knows who removed them or why. The pages leading up to the devil portrait are visibly darker than the rest of the book, worn down by centuries of readers turning straight to that one image. Not every disappearance in this period leaves behind a book or even a body. In southern France, a whole treasure vanished into legend and simply never came back. In 1233, Cathar leaders made the fortress of Montségur in Languedoc, the seat of their church, a haven for a Christian sect the Catholic Church considered heretical. In 1242, a group of men connected to the fortress murdered 2 Inquisition officials nearby, and the French crown responded with force. By May 1243, a royal army of around 10,000 troops laid siege to the fortress, held by roughly 100 fighters, along with the Cathar clergy and civilian refugees. The siege dragged on for nearly 10 months. In March 1244, attackers found a way through the fortress's outer defenses, and the defenders finally negotiated a surrender. Anyone could leave, except those who refused to renounce their faith. On the 16th of March, 1244, somewhere between 210 and 215 Cathars, led by Bishop Bertrand Marty, walked down to a pyre built at the base of the mountain and died in the flames. No one needed to force them onto stakes. The accounts say they went in voluntarily. The site is still called Prat dels Cremats, today the field of the burned. Before the surrender, according to the story that survived, 3 or 4 of the Cathar clergy escaped the fortress in secret to retrieve a treasure that had been buried in a nearby forest weeks earlier. What that treasure actually was is described only loosely. Valuable certainly, but also documents and possibly relics. What happened to it after that is a complete blank. The record simply stops. Nothing about its whereabouts has ever surfaced then or since. Roughly the same decades, on the other side of the world, 2 entire civilizations in North America were emptying out, for reasons that still are unsettled. Between roughly 900 and 1150, the ancestral Puebloan people of the Four Corners region, where Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado meet, had what's sometimes called a golden age. Reliable rain, growing trade networks, and Chaco Canyon's great houses connected by a road system running more than 180 miles. Around 1130, that changed. A 50-year drought set in, the start of a roughly 300-year arid stretch now called the Great Drought. Chaco's great houses were abandoned. Populations regrouped into dense, defensible cliff dwellings, like Mesa Verde's Mug House, where around 100 people packed into just 94 small rooms. Around the same time, religious buildings were deliberately taken apart, doorways sealed with rock and mortar, kiva roofs burned off on purpose. By the late 1200s, the whole region had emptied out. A 1997 excavation at a site called Cowboy Wash found 24 skeletons showing signs of violence, dismemberment, and what researchers describe as strong indications of cannibalism. Why people left is still unclear, and researchers say outright that no consensus exists. The drought is part of it, almost certainly. Pressure from other groups moving into the region, ancestors of the Ute, Shoshone, Paiute, and Navajo and Apache peoples, is another accepted factor. One researcher, Jonathan Haas, has argued for internal warfare driven by the environmental stress itself, pointing to villages relocating to defensible high ground late in the century. A separate view blames resource exhaustion around centers like Chaco, with fighting breaking out over what was left. Pueblo oral tradition offers yet another explanation entirely, that the ancestors deliberately dismantled their own ceremonial buildings as a kind of spiritual reset, undoing what they saw as their own misuse of religious power. Most modern Pueblo peoples don't describe this as a disappearance at all. Their own tradition holds that their ancestors moved to places with better rainfall and became the Pueblo communities that still exist today, a position shared by several early 20th century anthropologists, though it isn't treated as a fully settled answer either. A very similar story was unfolding at almost exactly the same time along the Mississippi River, in a city bigger than London was at the time. Around 600, a settlement began growing on the floodplain across the Mississippi River from what's now St. Louis, the site that would come to be called Cahokia. Mound building started by the 9th century. Then, around 1050, something researchers call the Big Bang happened. The whole settlement was suddenly replanted on a grid. Population surged from somewhere around 2,000 people to more than 10,000 in just 50 years, and local styles of pottery and building were replaced almost overnight with a single, unified culture. By the early 1100s, Cahokia was at its political peak. Religion was central to holding the city together. A lunar-aligned ceremonial site called the Emerald Acropolis, and public rituals that included mass human sacrifice. One burial pit, known as Mount 72, contains a man laid on a bed of 20,000 marine shell beads shaped like a bird, next to mass graves holding dozens of sacrificed people. In one grave, more than 50 women, all around 21 years old, were buried in 2 layers. In another, dozens of men and women were buried together, and the position of some of the skeleton's hands suggests a few of them were still alive when they went into the ground, still trying to dig themselves out. Around 1175, the city built its first defensive wall. People started leaving in larger numbers from the late 1100s onward. By the mid-1200s, the population had dropped by at least half. By 1350, the city was empty, and the wider region around it, sometimes called the vacant quarter, stayed largely unoccupied for the next 200 years. Nobody has settled on a single cause. Researchers who once blamed environmental damage, deforestation, overhunting, human-caused flooding, now say there's no solid evidence for any of that at Cahokia specifically. One theory, from researchers Thomas Emerson and Kristin Hedman, points instead to cultural fragmentation. Cahokia had absorbed a genuinely diverse population from different regions, and burial evidence shows immigrants were kept separate from locals even in death, suggesting the city never really unified the way its architecture implies. The defensive wall points to warfare, though the source material itself admits the wall may have served more of a ritual purpose than a military one. Even while noting that walls built with defensive bastions almost always point to warfare, a contradiction nobody has resolved. A separate theory blames a maize-heavy diet and the loss of a food processing technique that once made corn more nutritious, though there isn't firm evidence tying that directly to the city's collapse. Flooding has been ruled out as a main driver, since Cahokians had actually engineered channels, dikes, and levees against it. The most likely answer, researchers say, is that several of these factors hit at once, without any single one being the deciding blow. The mid-1200s brought a disaster far bigger than any single city's collapse, one that scientists could see the evidence of for decades before they knew what had caused it. In 1980, scientists studying an ice core from Greenland found an enormous spike in sulfate levels, dated to 1257 or 1258, with no known volcanic eruption on record that matched it. They called it the mystery eruption. Similar spikes turned up in ice cores from Antarctica and elsewhere, confirming it as a global event. One researchers eventually determined was the largest sulfate spike of the last 7,000 years, twice the size of the 1815 eruption of Tambora, the volcano famous for causing the year without a summer. For more than 3 decades, nobody could identify the volcano responsible. Several candidates were proposed and ruled out. A Tongan volcano too small to match, a site near Medina too small as well, others whose chemistry simply didn't match the ash trapped in the ice. In 2012, researchers first proposed the source might be Samalas, a volcano on the island of Lombok in Indonesia. The following year, a French geoscientist named Frank Lavigne confirmed it, using radiocarbon dating on trees on Lombok and matching the event against a palm leaf manuscript called the Babad Lombok, which describes what reads like an eyewitness account of 7 days of huge earthquakes shaking the ground, with people fleeing and some of them climbing into the hills. The eruption blew the top of the mountain, created the crater lake that's there today, and destroyed a city called Pamatan, the capital of a local kingdom that simply disappeared from the historical record afterward. A stretch of nearby coastline still carries a name that translates to quiet and without life, and it remains sparsely populated to this day. Ash from the eruption fell as far away as Java, more than 200 miles off. The eruption's aerosols triggered years of global cooling, and tree rings and historical records tied to crop failures and famine as far away as England, France, and Italy. Whether it also helped trigger the Little Ice Age, or whether it caused a subsequent El Niño event, is still argued over. Different climate proxies from the same period actually point in opposite directions on the El Niño question. Some researchers have floated a connection between the eruption and the later spread of the Black Death, roughly 90 years afterward, though that link is explicitly framed as speculative, not established. Around the same decades, someone in England was making a map so good for its time that historians still can't agree on who drew it or exactly when. The Gough map is the earliest reasonably accurate map of the whole of Great Britain to survive, held today at the Bodleian Library in Oxford. Nobody knows for certain when it was made. Early researchers assumed it dated to around 1300 under Edward I or Edward III. A later theory narrowed the window to somewhere between 1355 and 1366, based on details like a city wall shown under construction. More recent analysis of the handwriting instead points to a much later date, the early 1400s or possibly the 1370s, with revisions added as late as 1430. A 2012 research project used high-resolution scanning and spectral imaging to look even closer, and proposed the map isn't one single document at all, but 3 layers built up in stages between around 1390 and the late 1400s, each one re-inked, expanded, and revised by different hands. Nobody knows who made any of these layers, either. One theory credits a man or men who traveled with Edward I's military campaigns into Wales and Scotland, since those regions are drawn with unusual accuracy. Another theory points to a compilation drawn from several different people's local knowledge, county by county. Even the red lines running across the map, which have been called roads for over 200 years. The map is still sometimes nicknamed the Road Map of Britain, might not be roads at all. Recent scholarship treats them instead as rough distance indicators, not depictions of actual physical routes, partly because the network is strangely incomplete. There's no route shown running south or east out of London at all, and long stretches of a major Roman road are simply missing. The map holds up remarkably well against modern geography in places and remarkably poorly in others, and nobody has ever fully explained why or settled who actually made it. By the 1280s, in Germany, a much stranger disappearance was already being remembered as legend within living memory. The earliest hard evidence for the Pied Piper story is a stained glass window installed in a church in Hamelin, Germany, around 1300, showing a colorfully dressed piper and children in white. That window was destroyed in 1660, but its description survived in later records. A town record from 1384 states plainly that it had been 100 years since the children left, pointing back to an event in 1284. The fullest early account comes from a manuscript written around 1440, discovered centuries later in an archive in Lüneburg. It describes a well-dressed piper, about 30 years old, who entered Hamelin on the 26th of June, 1284, played a silver pipe, and led 130 children out through the town's east gate to what the text describes as an execution place, or Calvary, where they vanished completely. Mothers reportedly searched from town to town afterward and never found them. Rats don't appear anywhere in the story until a version written around 1560, nearly 300 years after the supposed event, meaning the whole rat catcher element that most people know today was added on far later than the disappearance itself. Nobody has ever settled what actually happened to the children. One theory holds they died in some kind of natural disaster, disease, drowning in the nearby river, or a landslide during a ritual dance, with the Piper rat as a symbolic figure representing death itself. A more specific theory, championed by the linguist Jürgen Udolph, argues the so-called children were actually young adults recruited to help colonize newly opened land further east, in places like Moravia, East Prussia, and Pomerania, following a German military victory in 1227, a theory supported by matching surnames and place names that turn up in both regions, though it remains circumstantial. Another theory connects the story to genuine outbreaks of dancing mania recorded in the same century, including a documented 1237 case of children dancing all the way from Erfurt to a town 20 kilometers away. A separate theory ties it to a military or religious expedition, similar in spirit to the Children's Crusade 70 years earlier, with the Piper legend invented afterward to avoid blame. One modern writer claimed, without citing any evidence at all, that the Piper was a child predator who abused the children in unspeakable ways, a claim historians have specifically and directly criticized as unsupported. A street in Hamelin called Bangalowsenstraße, meaning street without drums, still bans music and dancing today, centuries after whatever actually happened there. Far to the east, around these same decades, one of the largest cities in the pre-industrial world was already coming apart, for reasons that are still argued over today. At its height, Angkor, the capital of the Khmer Empire in what's now Cambodia, covered more than 1,000 square kilometers of connected temples, roads, and waterways. By one estimate, the largest pre-industrial city in the world, by surface area, home to somewhere between 750,000 and 1 million people. Angkor Wat alone, built between 1113 and 1150, has outer walls running nearly half a mile on each side. In 1296, a Chinese diplomat named Zhou Daguan spent about a year there and wrote a detailed account describing ongoing wars and a country left completely devastated by conflict. Around 1150, internal power struggles had already weakened the kingdom, and in 1177, a rival kingdom launched a waterborne invasion that sacked the capital and killed the king. Though the empire recovered under a new ruler who built the Bayon temple and shifted the state religion toward Buddhism. Archaeologists have since dated the moat around one of Angkor's inner cities to no longer being in active use by around 1431. The same year, the city was sacked again, this time by the kingdom of Ayutthaya. Afterward, the population largely moved south, and by the mid-1400s, nearly all of Angkor was abandoned, except for Angkor Wat itself, which stayed in use as a Buddhist shrine. The war with Ayutthaya is the most commonly cited trigger for the final abandonment, and Zhou Daguan's own account backs up the idea of a country already worn down by conflict decades earlier. A historian named George Coedes argued the deeper cause was religious. The empire's shift toward Theravada Buddhism, which rejects the idea of an all-powerful individual, undermined the god-king cult that had justified centuries of forced labor and monument building in the first place. A single temple, Taprom, required over 12,000 people to maintain it, with an estimated 300,000 farm workers needed just to feed everyone working on the temples. Coedes also blamed neglect of the region's canal system as a weakened government stopped maintaining the irrigation network that fed the population. A more recent line of research points to climate. Tree-ring studies from Vietnam show weakened monsoons in the 13 and 1400s, followed by extreme flooding. And separate research ties the period to a severe early 15th century drought as the world shifted out of the medieval warm period and into what's now called the Little Ice Age, conditions that may have dried up the canals and reservoirs the whole system depended on. Historians describe all of this as running in parallel rather than picking one deciding cause: war, religious change, failing infrastructure, and a changing climate hitting a system that was already fragile at more or less the same time. Which one mattered most has never been settled. Back in Europe, in 1308, a set of confessions taken behind closed doors would end up raising almost as many questions as it answered. On the 13th of October, 1307, King Philip IV of France had every Templar in the country arrested at once, including the order's Grand Master, Jacques de Molay. Under pressure from Philip, Pope Clement V ordered Templars arrested across the rest of Christendom the following month. By the summer of 1308, most of the arrested Templars had appeared before the Pope at Poitiers and received absolution. 5 of the order's top leaders, including Molay, were instead sent to Chinon Castle, where 3 cardinals interrogated them individually between the 17th and 20th of August, 1308. Each man confessed to the charges against him, most involving denials of Christ during initiation rites, and each was formally absolved and restored to communion with the Church. That document, known today as the Chinon Parchment, was misfiled and forgotten in the Vatican's archives for centuries. A paleographer named Barbara Frail rediscovered it in September 2001, and the Vatican published a limited edition of it in 2007. One detail in the record has never been explained. A separate papal document, dated the 12th of August, 1308, already announces that Molay and the other leaders have been absolved and reconciled to the Church, 8 days before the Chinon hearings described in the parchment actually took place. Whether that's simply a dating error, or the Pope somehow already knew what the outcome would be before it happened, has never been resolved. The source material itself says only that it still needs more investigation. There's also a second, conflicting record of the same hearings, kept by the French Royal Chancery, which gives the impression that French lawyers were present for the interrogations alongside the Church's own officials, directly at odds with the Vatican's own parchment, which describes the hearings as conducted by churchmen alone. Historians think the French version was probably compiled secondhand, from verbal reports rather than the parchment itself, but that's an inference, not a settled fact. None of this saved the Templars. Despite the absolutions, King Philip kept pressing the case, and the Pope formally dissolved the order in 1312. 2 years later, Molay and another Templar leader, having recanted their earlier confessions, were burned at the stake as relapsed heretics, a fairly brutal ending for 2 men the Church's own paperwork had already forgiven. Within a few decades, a disease reached Europe that would kill a larger share of the population than any war on this list. And even now, nobody agrees on exactly where it started. The plague that became known as the Black Death reached Europe in 1347, most likely carried by Genoese traders fleeing the port of Kaffa in Crimea during a siege by a Mongol army. From Crimea, it reached Constantinople by the summer of 1347, killing the 13-year-old son of the Byzantine emperor. It reached Genoa and Venice by January 1348, then France, Spain, and England by 1349, and Russia by the early 1350s. over the next several years, it may have reduced the world's population from around 450 million to somewhere between 350 and 375 million. Where it actually started before reaching Crimea is still disputed. Two medieval Arab historians blamed Mongolia, based on Chinese records describing a huge outbreak there in the early 1330s. More recent research instead points to Central Asia, specifically the Tian Shan Mountains in modern Kyrgyzstan, where scientists have found the plague bacterium in the teeth of people buried in local cemeteries from that period. Direct physical evidence rather than a historical guess. Other, more recent research points instead to the northwestern shores of the Caspian Sea. The record summarizing all this evidence states plainly that the origin was either Central Asia or Crimea, without resolving which. There's also a real question about how far the pandemic actually spread. The Arab historian's account assumes it reached India and China as part of the same wave, but modern research on the historical record of both the Delhi Sultanate and the Yuan dynasty in China has found no clear evidence of a matching epidemic in either place at the time, which complicates the idea that this was a single, unbroken chain of infection running from Asia straight through to Europe. Even the famous story of how the disease reached Kaffa in the first place, that a Mongol army catapulted infected corpses over the city walls, is probably not the real mechanism. Historians now think it's more likely that infected rats simply crossed the siege lines on their own, spreading the disease the ordinary way. The plague kept coming back for centuries after 1347. It returned to London in the early 1360s, killing a fifth of the city, and again in 1369, killing another 10th to 15%. It didn't fully disappear from Europe until the early 1800s, and even that disappearance is, by one historian's own account, still not well understood, with half a dozen competing explanations on offer and no single one confirmed. 7 years after the plague reached Europe, a cloth went on display in a small French church that people are still arguing about today. Around 1355, a church in Liry, France, began displaying a linen cloth bearing a faint image of a man's body, said to be the burial shroud of Jesus, the cloth now known as the Shroud of Turin. Within a few decades, a bishop named Pierre d'Arcis had declared it a forgery, and the Pope issued instructions permitting its display only as a devotional artwork, not a genuine relic. It changed hands over the following century, survived a fire in 1532, and has been kept in Turin, Italy since 1578. In 1898, an amateur photographer named Secondo Pia photographed the cloth and discovered that the faint image reads far more clearly as a photographic negative than to the naked eye, a detail that's driven a lot of the fascination with it ever since. In 1988, 3 separate laboratories in Oxford, Arizona, and Switzerland radiocarbon dated the cloth to somewhere between 1260 and 1390, squarely inside the medieval period rather than the 1st century. How the image actually got onto the cloth has never been fully explained, even by researchers who accept the medieval date. A chemist named Walter Macrone examined it in 1978 and concluded the image was painted using red ochre pigment in a gelatin base, finding other members of the same research team disputed. A researcher named Luigi Garlascelli reproduced a similar image in 2009 using period-accurate materials and a rubbing technique, though another researcher argued the technique couldn't reproduce all the cloth's specific properties. Other researchers have reproduced comparable images by rubbing pigment over cloth draped across a carved relief, or through a kind of medieval optical projection, though a historian of photography has called that particular theory reliant on hindsight more than evidence. None of these experiments has fully matched every property of the original image at once. The record summarizing all this research states plainly that exactly how the image got onto the cloth remains debated and unclear. The idea that the image was somehow produced by a burst of radiation at the moment of resurrection has also been raised, and directly rejected by one of the Shroud's own research team members as running counter to the laws of physics. A 2015 genetic study found plant and human DNA on the cloth from populations across Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and India. A result, the researchers themselves said, doesn't prove anything about the cloth's age or origin, one way or the other. The Catholic Church has never formally declared the shroud authentic or fake. Popes have consistently used careful, hedged language, calling it an icon rather than confirming it as a genuine relic. 15 years after that cloth first went on display, one of the worst storms in medieval European history hit the North Sea coast in a single night and swallowed 3 towns whole. On the night of the 15th to 16th of January 1362, a storm now known as the Grote Mandrenke, Low German for the Great Drowning of Men, tore through the coastlines of England, Germany, and the Netherlands. It's estimated to have killed around 25,000 people and destroyed as many as 30 settlements. 3 of them are worth telling together, because each one disappeared in a slightly different way. Rangholt sat on the island of Strand, in what's now northern Germany, and most of what's actually known about it comes from later legend rather than contemporary record. Most surviving documents describing the town were written a full 2 centuries after it was destroyed. Archaeologists estimate it may have had as many as 500 houses and around 3,000 people trading in agricultural goods, though those are estimates built from excavation, not a contemporary census. Ruins believed to belong to the town were first found near a small island called Hallig Soetval in 1921, but it took another century to confirm it. German researchers didn't scientifically verify the identification until June 2023, after mapping 10 square kilometers of remains, including a church and a harbor. In the meantime, Rangholt had become something of a local legend, sometimes called the Atlantis of the North Sea, a modest farming settlement inflated over the centuries into a wealthy town destroyed by God as punishment for its residents' sins. Local stories still hold that the church bells can be heard ringing beneath the water on calm nights. Ravensher Odd, at the mouth of the Humber estuary in England, had the opposite trajectory, a real boomtown, not a myth. Founded in the mid-1200s on shifting sandbanks, it had grown to more than 100 houses and a busy market by 1299, with its own borough charter, court and prison, and it collected fees from more than 100 merchant ships a year. For a while, it actually outranked the nearby port of Hull and sent its own representatives to Parliament. The same sandbanks that let it grow eventually gave way beneath it. The Crown funded repairs to its quay 6 separate times between 1329 and 1347. An official inquiry in 1346 found flood damage so severe that only a third of the townspeople were left. Storms over the winter of 1356 and 1357 flooded it completely, and the Grote Mandrenke finished the job. The site is entirely underwater today, and as of a 2022 search, researchers were still hoping to locate its actual foundations beneath the waves. A hope, not yet a confirmed find. Dunwich, further down the English coast in Suffolk, had been the capital of an Anglo-Saxon kingdom centuries earlier, and by 1086, the Domesday Book recorded 3 churches and around 3,000 people living there. Its decline is often told as a single dramatic storm sweeping the whole town into the sea, but that's not quite accurate. A string of storms in 1286, 1287, 1328, and a particularly bad one in 1347 that swept around 400 houses away, combined with the slow migration of the river mouth roughly 2.5 miles north, which took away the town's reason for existing as a port in the first place. The Grootmandrenke destroyed much of what was left. All 8 of the town's medieval churches eventually went into the sea, one at a time, over the following centuries. The last one, All Saints' Church, finally lost its tower sometime between 1919 and 1922. Sources disagree on the exact year. Despite having almost no population left, Dunwich kept the right to send 2 members to Parliament until 1832, making it one of England's most notorious rotten boroughs. By 2022, only a single gravestone remained standing near the current cliff edge, waiting its turn. Marine surveys using sonar in the 2000s and 2010s mapped what's now called the largest medieval underwater site in Europe, off the coast where Dunwich used to stand. 12 years after that storm, a different kind of crisis broke out across mainland Europe. This one had nothing to do with weather at all. In 1374, in the city of Aachen, people began dancing in the streets uncontrollably in an outbreak of what would come to be called dancing mania, and it spread fast to Cologne, to Flanders, into Franconia, to Strasbourg, and beyond. It wasn't the first outbreak of its kind. Smaller incidents go back centuries earlier. 18 peasants dancing around a church on Christmas Eve sometime in the 1020s. 200 people dancing on a bridge over the River Meuse in 1278 with enough force to collapse it, and a group of children in 1237 who danced roughly 20 kilometers from Erfurt to a neighboring town. A related phenomenon in Italy, called tarantism and blamed on spider or scorpion bites, ran in parallel for centuries, with small outbreaks recorded as late as 1959. Another major outbreak hit Strasbourg in July 1518, starting with a single woman dancing in the street and growing to somewhere between 50 and 400 people within weeks. Nobody has ever agreed on what actually caused any of it. One theory blames ergot poisoning, a fungus that grows on grain and produces hallucinogenic effects. But ergotism doesn't explain every symptom recorded, things like an apparent inability to see the color red, or dancers who reportedly couldn't stand the sight of pointed shoes. Other medical theories point to encephalitis, epilepsy, or typhus with the same problem. None of them account for the full range of behavior described. A more sociological theory holds that the dancing was a response to genuine, shared stress and hardship, not a physical illness at all. Another argues it spread the way rumors do, along trade routes, wherever people already knew the pattern and expected it to happen to them. A different theory holds some outbreaks were staged religious rituals, disguised as mass hysteria to get around bans on older pagan practices. Physician accounts from the period describe individual cases lasting years. One woman reportedly danced every year for 2 decades, another for 32 years straight. Whatever caused it, the phenomenon eventually got folded into ordinary medicine. What was once called Saint Vitus's dance was reclassified in the 1600s as Sydenham's chorea, a genuine neurological condition, though the record summarizing all this calls that particular reclassification unconvincing as an explanation for the earlier mass outbreaks. As with most of the entries on this list, the question of what actually happened to those crowds of dancers has never been closed. Sometime in the early 1400s, in Italy, someone produced a book that's never been read by anyone. Not then, and not since. Radiocarbon testing in 2009 dated the vellum of the Voynich manuscript to somewhere between 1404 and 1438, made from at least 14 or 15 calfskins. Its full text runs to around 38,000 words, written in a script that doesn't match any known language, alongside illustrations of plants that don't match any known species, star charts, and small human figures bathing in green liquid through connected pipes. Its earliest confirmed owner is an alchemist in Prague named Georg Bareš, mentioned in a 1639 letter asking a Jesuit scholar for help deciphering it. After passing through a few more hands, it likely sat untraced in a Roman library for about 200 years, until a book dealer named Wilfrid Voynich bought it in 1912 as part of a batch of manuscripts quietly sold off by the Jesuits. It eventually reached Yale University in 1969, where it's been held ever since. Nobody has ever deciphered it. Professional code breakers from both world wars looked at it and got nowhere. A long list of claimed solutions has been proposed and knocked down one after another. A theory that the medieval scholar Roger Bacon wrote it is now considered largely discredited. A claim that it was written in colonial Mexico in the 1560s in the Aztec language Nahuatl directly contradicts the radiocarbon dating and has been criticized by other researchers as pure speculation. A 2019 claim that it was written in an early form of Romance language was disavowed by the researcher's own university, with one manuscript expert describing the method behind it as circular and wishful, and, in her words, close to gibberish. A 2017 claim that it described women's health in coded Latin was criticized because the proposed translation doesn't actually make sense as Latin. Claims involving Hebrew, Old Turkic, Ukrainian, and a made-up shorthand system have all been proposed and rejected in turn. Some researchers think the whole thing might be an elaborate hoax. A table-based word generation method from the early 2000s can mimic some of the manuscript's statistical patterns. Other researchers, using more recent computational analysis, have found genuine semantic clustering in the text that a random hoax method probably wouldn't produce, which argues the other way. Even the entropy of the text, a rough measure of how predictable each word is based on the words around it, sits close to what real languages like English or Latin produce, rather than to meaningless noise. Whatever it says, if it says anything at all, remains exactly as unread today as it was when Georg Bareš first asked for help with it, almost 400 years ago. A few decades later, two more volcanic eruptions blotted out the sky the way the one back in 536 had, and one of them still hasn't been traced to a mountain. Ice cores show a massive sulfate spike dated to 1452 or 1453, originally believed to be one single eruption alongside another large spike that researchers eventually determined belonged to a separate event in 1458. The two were only distinguished from each other after more precise ice core dating techniques became available in 2012. The 1452 eruption shows up more strongly in Greenland's ice than in Antarctica's, which points to a source somewhere in the northern hemisphere, though the specific volcano has never been identified. There's no matching ash deposit anywhere that scientists have been able to find. What's better documented is the fallout. Tree rings across Europe, Asia, and North America show a sharp cooling. In the summer of 1453, oak growth rings in British portrait paintings from those years came in unusually narrow. Grain tides recorded in Sweden dropped to nothing, and records from Ming Dynasty China describe deadly snow and famine, with the Yellow Sea freezing over 20 kilometers from shore. That same year, 1453, also happened to be the year Constantinople fell to the Ottomans, and a researcher named Kevin Pang has connected a string of strange atmospheric events in the city's final days, a dark lunar eclipse, a violent hailstorm and flood, an unusually thick fog, and reports of flame-like light around the dome of the Hagia Sophia to volcanic activity in the atmosphere at the time. Even Punk's own analysis stops short of certainty here, noting only that some kind of eruption was likely responsible, without being able to say definitively which one. The 1458 eruption was even larger, among the biggest sulfate spikes recorded in the last 700 years, roughly on the same scale as Tambora in 1815, and it cooled the northern hemisphere by around 1 degree Celsius the following summer. A volcano called Kauai in the South Pacific near Vanuatu was long assumed to be the source, based partly on local folklore describing a catastrophic mid-15th century eruption there. But researchers who checked the physical evidence in 2007 found the actual volcanic deposits at Kauai were too small to match an eruption of this scale, and the chemistry of the ash doesn't line up either. A volcano in Tonga was proposed as an alternative, based on similar dating, though the match there isn't confirmed either. A volcano in South America called Mount Reclus has chemistry that resembles the ice core ash more closely, except there's no record of any eruption at Reclus large enough to have caused a global event like this one. Two separate global climate disasters, both large enough to freeze rivers and starve harvest continents apart, and neither one has ever been traced back to an actual mountain. Around the same decades, across the North Atlantic, a European colony that had survived in Greenland for nearly 500 years went silent. In 982, an Icelandic man named Eric the Red, exiled for murder, sailed west and explored the coast of a new land, which he named Greenland, according to the sagas, mostly as marketing to make the place sound more appealing than it was. He returned to recruit settlers, and around 700 people left on 25 ships. Only 14 ships actually made it. They founded a settlement that grew over the following centuries to somewhere between 2,000 and 10,000 people, spread across roughly 620 farms, with its own bishop from 1126 onward. The colony survived for close to 500 years. Then it didn't. In 1350, a priest sent to check on the northern of the colony's two settlements found nobody living there at all. A rescue expedition sent 5 years later found the same thing. The last confirmed record of Norse life in Greenland is a wedding at Havalsey Church on the 14th of September, 1408. After that, the sightings get sparse and increasingly unreliable. A bishop in 1534 claimed to have seen people and sheep pens from a distance. A ship's captain in 1541 said he couldn't reach anyone alive there. A European ship, sometime in the 1540s, reportedly found the corpse of a single Norseman lying face down on the ground, fully dressed, with a worn knife beside him. The last claimed sighting of any Norse Greenlander at all, dead or alive. By 1585, an English explorer found no Europeans there whatsoever, and Danish search expeditions in the early 1600s couldn't even relocate where the settlements had been. What actually happened to them is still not settled, and the record itself calls it a slow process with several layered causes, rather than one single event. Cut off from European trade is one common explanation, though archaeological evidence shows the colonists kept following continental European clothing fashions right up until the end, which argues against total isolation. Conflict with the Inuit, who arrived in the region around 1200 and became the dominant population by 1300, is well documented in general, though specific attacks recorded in old sources have been reinterpreted by some modern historians as describing entirely different, unrelated conflicts in Norway. Starvation and malnutrition is another common explanation, backed by smaller, sicklier skeletons found in one cemetery excavation, but directly disputed by another researcher who found a well-stocked pantry in the other settlement, which doesn't fit a starving population. A cooling climate, as the world slid into the Little Ice Age, is broadly accepted as a contributing factor, though one 2022 study argues drought, not cold, was the bigger driver, and a 2023 study proposes rising sea levels may have flooded parts of the settlement outright. That one is explicitly presented as conditional, not confirmed. The Black Death has also been proposed as a factor, though the record states plainly there's no actual evidence it ever reached Greenland at all. One 2013 excavation found evidence the Norse had adapted their diet heavily towards seals before the end, and had swapped cattle for hardier goats and sheep, suggesting the population wasn't caught by surprise so much as it slowly gave up and left. Aided by land opening up back in Iceland and Norway after the plague had emptied both of them out. That reading suggests a slow, practical retreat, not a single catastrophe. Nobody has confirmed it as the final answer either. Back in England, 75 years after that last Greenland wedding, two young princes walked into the Tower of London and were never confirmed seen again. King Edward IV of England died on the 9th of April, 1483, leaving two sons, Edward, aged 12, and his younger brother, Richard, aged 9. Their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was named Lord Protector, intercepted the young king's party before he could reach London, and arrested and later executed the boy's uncle and half-brother. Edward was lodged in the Tower of London on the 19th of May to await his coronation. His younger brother joined him there a month later. On the 25th of June, a group of lords petitioned Gloucester to take the throne himself, and Parliament declared both boys illegitimate. Gloucester was crowned Richard III on the 6th of July, 1483. The two boys were reportedly seen playing in the Tower grounds shortly after Richard joined his brother there. After that summer, there's no confirmed sighting of either of them again. Rumors that they had been murdered had reached France by January of the following year. In 1674, workmen remodeling a tower staircase dug up a box containing two children's skeletons, 10 feet down. They were widely assumed to be the princes and were reburied at Westminster Abbey on the order of King Charles II. A re-examination in 1933 estimated ages roughly consistent with the princes, but didn't even attempt to determine the sex of either skeleton, and no DNA testing has ever been done on them, despite a petition asking for it. The record behind all this states plainly that, other than their disappearance, there's no direct evidence the princes were ever murdered. Several named historians consider Richard the most likely person responsible, based mostly on motive. He had the most to gain from their deaths. A later account, written around 1513 by Thomas More, names a knight called James Tyrrell as the actual killer, acting on Richard's orders, and claims Tyrrell confessed before his own execution in 1502. But no such confession has ever actually been found, and one modern historian has suggested More's story might be closer to invented folklore than fact, comparing it directly to the Old English tale of the babes in the wood. Other historians have pointed instead to the Duke of Buckingham, based on a contemporary Portuguese document and a separate record discovered in 1980, though most think it unlikely Buckingham could have acted without Richard knowing. A small number of historians have floated Henry VII, who took the throne 2 years later and had his own reasons to want any Yorkist heirs gone, though if Henry had actually killed them, one historian points out, producing the bodies and blaming Richard would have made more political sense than staying silent about it. Two separate men, later claimed to actually be the younger prince, Richard, grown up. One, known as Lambert Simnel, was crowned as a rival king in Dublin in 1487 before being captured. His supporters later claimed he was actually a different lost heir. The other, Perkin Warbeck, was recognized as the legitimate Prince Richard by both the Duchess of Burgundy and the King of Scotland for years before he too was captured and, in 1499, executed. A modern research project has more recently claimed archival evidence that both princes actually survived into the 1490s under assumed identities, a claim that remains disputed and unconfirmed, like nearly everything else about the case. More than 500 years on, nobody has ever proven what happened to either boy after that last recorded summer in the Tower. 2 years after Richard III lost his own throne at Bosworth Field, the very battle English historians usually use to mark the end of the Middle Ages, a new disease appeared in England that would keep coming back for the next 70 years and that nobody has ever identified. The first confirmed outbreak of what came to be called the sweating sickness began in August 1485, right as Henry Tudor's invasion force landed and fought the Battle of Bosworth Field. Thomas Stanley, a nobleman who ended up switching sides during that battle, reportedly cited the disease as his excuse for not joining Richard's army beforehand. The sickness broke out in London itself in September, killing several thousand people within weeks, including 2 Lord Mayors and 6 aldermen. It came in distinct waves after that. Outbreaks in the early 1500s, in 1517, and a particularly bad one in 1528 that repeatedly forced Henry VIII to flee his own court, killed Thomas Cromwell's wife and 2 daughters, and struck both Anne Boleyn and Cardinal Wolsey, who each survived. It spread briefly to the European mainland in 1529, reaching Hamburg, then the Baltic coast, then Antwerp and Amsterdam within a single day of each other, before disappearing from the continent entirely by the end of that year and never coming back there. Its last major English outbreak hit Shrewsbury in 1551, killing around 1,000 people before it burned out again by autumn. The disease killed astonishingly fast. Most who died did so within 8 to 10 hours of the first symptoms, sometimes in less than a day from apparently perfect health. Men in their 30s and 40s died at the highest rate. Then, after 1551, it simply stopped and never returned to England again. Nobody has ever identified what actually caused it. The record states this outright. The cause is unknown, and how it spread from person to person remains a mystery too. Attempts to test old remains for genetic traces of a pathogen have failed, because there isn't enough surviving DNA or RNA left to work with. Contemporary writers blamed poor sanitation and dirty water. Modern researchers have proposed relapsing fever, an illness carried by ticks and lice, but that disease normally leaves a distinctive scab at the site of the bite along with the rash, and neither shows up in any surviving description of the sweating sickness. Ergot poisoning has been ruled out too, since England grew far less of the rye grain that ergot needs to grow on than the rest of Europe did. A more recent theory proposes some kind of hantavirus based on matching seasonal patterns and symptoms. Though modern hantaviruses don't typically vanish the way this disease did, and rarely spread directly between people, the way this one clearly did. Another researcher has proposed anthrax, picked up from contaminated wool or animal carcasses, and has suggested exhuming old victims to test for it directly. That hasn't happened. The Middle Ages, by most English accounts, had already ended by the time any of this happened. The disease itself started at the exact moment the era is usually said to have closed, killed intermittently for 2 generations afterward, and then went quiet for good. Its cause never settled any more than the century of unsettled questions that came before it.